So already on stage, Professor Dr. Henrik Svensmark. Er ist der Direktor des Center for Sun Climate Research des dänischen Nationalen Weltraumzentrums. 1988 bis 1993 hat er an der University of California, Berkeley, am Nordic Institute of Theoretical Physics und am Niels Bohr Institut gearbeitet. Anschließend arbeitete er am dänischen Meteorologischen Institut. Svensmark wurde zusammen mit Egil Friis Christensen 1997 durch ihre Arbeiten zu einem Zusammenhang zwischen kosmischer Strahlung und Klimawandel der Kosmoklimatologie zu einem größeren Publikum bekannt. Svensmark untersuchte den Zusammenhang zwischen den kosmischen Strahlen und der Wolkenbildung in der unteren Atmosphäre sowie zwischen Sonnenaktivität und der kosmischen Strahlung. In beiden Fällen stellte er teilweise überlappende Zusammenhänge fest. Das zur Überprüfung seiner Theorie von ihm durchgeführte Projekt SKY legte die Grundlage für das 2014 am CERN angeschlossene Forschungsprojekt CLOUD.
So I'm going to talk about this cosmic ray climate link and talk about some of the experiments that we have been doing and some experimental evidence. Sorry, I have to figure this out. Yeah. So the first part is sort of some of the things that already have been touched upon, but I will see if I can go in a little more detail, and hopefully by repeating some of it, it might not harm. The second part is something that I have been working on. It's based on some of Niels' work. It's on very long timescales, and I want to show you some remarkable correlations that we find where changes in climate also, because they are so large on geological timescales, that they also influenced life. I will show you some of that results. So, what are cosmic rays? Well, typically you have a supernova that goes off, and then you have this explosion produces a shock wave where you have acceleration of particles, and these particles are moving in interstellar space, and some of them will enter into the solar system and might end up in the top of the atmosphere. So you can imagine a proton coming in with a very high energy, and it produces one of these shower structures where you get maybe millions of secondary particles that are moving down through the atmosphere. And this type of particle here with this energy, I mean, it's hitting the Earth probably every second, every square meter. So in the air that we have here, you will see, if you could see it, it will be like it was raining all the time with these particles. So what do the particles do? Well, they ionize the atmosphere, and that is one of the important things when we are going to talk about the clouds. And a second thing is that they produce new isotopes because the energy is so high. And one of the isotopes, it is carbon-14, and carbon-14 then goes together with oxygen and becomes CO2, and CO2 goes into the leaves, and then it might end up in a tree ring, and then by looking at the various tree rings and measuring the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12, you can actually say something about how active, how much cosmic rays enters into the atmosphere at that time. So solar activity is modulating because of the sun's magnetic field, can modulate how many particles are entering into the atmosphere. So when solar activity goes up, it screens against cosmic rays, so you get fewer cosmic rays. So here you have a figure where you look at one of these from tree rings, where you look at the carbon-14, and you can see here you have a period where you have actually high solar activity. The cosmic rays are increasing downwards. So here, this is what a period where we have high solar activity. Then we have a period where we have this lower solar activity. And if we compare with changes in temperature, you already seen a number of very nice correlations. you see that each time you have a significant change in the cosmic rays, you actually have a change in the climate or in the temperature on the Earth. So there are these correlations, and one of the big questions, or one of the questions that was asked quite early, was what could be the effect that could change the Earth's energy budget. And when you look at this picture here of it's a weather satellite, you can see the clouds it's very beautiful with the clouds. And the effect of clouds is they cool the Earth with 20 to 30 watts per square meter. And if you can then imagine that you made a systematic change in the amount of cloudiness, it would be a very effective way of changing the Earth's energy budget. So with this idea, originally we looked at the changes in clouds taken from satellites. This is called the ISKIP dataset. It's all the geostationary satellites plus 2 polar orbiting satellites. It's extremely difficult to measure with the high accuracy the Earth's cloud cover. And in order to do it, you have to have a whole fleet of satellites which are intercalibrated. So it's a real challenge. Here you see the red curve. That is a change in cosmic rays. You see the solar cycle variation. It's 11 years more or less. So here we have high solar activity, and here we have low solar activity, and you see this very nice correlation. This big dip here is because we have a very strong El Nino, meaning that you get a lot of medium high to high clouds over the tropics, and you don't see as many low clouds. So, I mean, the satellite is only seeing the top of the clouds, and you can see here you have 29% in the satellite measurements. So the calibration actually breaks down after 2005, and we don't really have any continuation of this curve. So it indicates that there could be such a correlation that we have been looking for, some kind of a connection between the two, but it could also be some other solar activity that is affecting things, or it could even be that it was completely accidental. So what we could do is to try to understand, the processes that are going on when you are producing clouds. And in order to get a cloud, you have to have particles in the atmosphere of a certain size. These are called aerosols, and if they are sufficiently large that water vapor can condense on them at maybe less than 1% supersaturation, well, we call it a cloud condensation nuclei. And the big question is, of course, where do these cloud condensation nuclei come from? So at least half, and especially over the oceans, they are actually produced by gases. So you have some molecules that are in a gas form. And then the idea is that you have the cosmic rays coming in, it ionizes the atmosphere, and you have the charges on the molecules. And then, because of the electrostatic interactions, the polar molecules, it stabilizes small clusters. And if you have a stabilized small cluster, it means that it doesn't evaporate very readily, and therefore it can then eventually grow by more gases, or because you have collisions between other aerosol particles. And this process here, it takes about at least on the order of a week in order to become a cloud condensation nuclei. So the idea is, if you increase the ionization, then perhaps you are producing more of these cloud condensation nuclei. And more cloud condensation nuclei, that will be quite important for cloud properties. And I can show you this type of evidence. So what you see here is regions, it's satellite pictures over the oceans. and you can see regions with low clouds, and then you see these stripes here. And these are ship tracks. So you have a ship sailing along, and because they had all that dirty fuel, it pumps out extra cloud condensation nuclei. And you can see that because you have more cloud condensation nuclei, you are actually changing the microphysics of the cloud and becomes much more wide. So this is the fundamental idea that by changing the number of cloud condensation nuclei, maybe we can control the reflection of sunlight from the clouds, and therefore the energy, it will affect the energy budget of the Earth. So with this idea, we could do a lot of experiments. We have done experiments over many years now. We did experiments in the my home institution here. There's also experiment at CERN in Geneva. And here, this is another part of Denmark where they have an accelerator. And we even went underground 1 kilometer in a dark matter laboratory in order to get rid of cosmic rays to see what would happen with the nucleation. So when we did this type of experiments, we can sort of summarize the results in this graph here. So the idea is that we make some experiments where we have radioactive sources. These are just, I mean, simple, it's not an accelerator, it's just a radioactive material that ionizes with gamma rays, the experimental volume. And then we put in the gases that might be over the Pacific. And then we can increase the ionization, and then we can measure how many small particles. They are in the size of about 3 nanometers, so they are really small. They're not cloud condensation nuclei. And what we see, and what have been seen in many of these experiments, is that it actually works in the sense that when we increase the ionization, we produce more aerosols. So this is something that experimentally seems to be verified. But there is a problem because a number, even when CERN did this type of experiment, if this is the one we have shown in our experiment, it needs to grow to a particle of this size here and takes about a week. And there is a big chance that this small particle will get lost for instance, to other large particles. And so what people have been doing, when these results came out and it showed that there was a large sensitivity to the number of small particles, they used climate models. So they tried to take a big climate model, add small particles, and then see what happened. So we are talking about these huge supercomputers to calculate these things, and I can show you a result here. So you can imagine this is the size of the particles. This is around 3 nanometers. That's where we have experimental evidence, and then they have to grow up to this size here. And if it's going to work, then they had to grow and change things here. So if we have maybe 3 or 5% changes in the number of nucleated small particles, it has to be 1 to 3% also here. But all these experiments, numerical experiments, they showed that these particles, the response, they simply disappeared, and the response was so small that it couldn't make any change in the number of CCNs, cloud condensation nuclei. And that means that if that's true, the whole idea that we're talking about doesn't work. So the whole idea is dead. But fortunately, instead of using computer models, we can try to look at nature's own experiments. What you see here is, well, it is a visualization of the sun, and you have the Earth here, and then you see plasma being thrown out from the sun. And if this plasma hits the sun in the right way, it makes the cosmic rays drop quite dramatically within a week as this plasma is moving out, and then after a few weeks the cosmic rays are getting back to the normal size. You can see the effect here. This is one of the largest, it's a very large event. It's actually a Halloween event in 2003, and you can see here the plasma hits the Earth. This is measures at Earth. And then over this is days in the year, and you can see that it sort of goes back again. So this is like a natural experiment, and we can then test the whole idea. So when these events are happening, we can then use satellite observations, and we can use observation of aerosols. And when we get results that look something like this, so what you see here is the drop in cosmic rays. This is this red curve. This is 15 days before, and this is 20 days after. Here we actually look at aerosols. So we see there's a big drop in the in these properties of the aerosols, and then we have three different satellite data sets. Here is this liquid water as a cloud liquid water, and you can see that about 5 to 7 days later, there is a minimum in the liquid water. That's simply because here we have a generation of very small particles. There are fewer of them, and then it takes about a week for them to grow. So here you have this generation where there are not that many, and therefore this is dropping. At least that is consistent, and you see the same thing in the other data sets. So I mean, you can say that we see it from solar activity to cosmic rays to aerosols to clouds, and we can also see in the radiative budget. This is the CEERS instrument. So what we have here is the Earth, and this is average the week before these Phobos decreases, and you see that during the week when we have the Phobos decrease. This is the shortwave. You actually get much more shortwave getting into the surface. So we have a forcing, and the forcing is on the order of 3 watts per square meter during these events. And it all is fairly consistent with the changes in the microphysics of the clouds. So what this shows is that when we look at I mean, take the observations, they don't support what you get from the models, and were very baffled trying to understand why that it works when all the models were getting that it shouldn't work, and it took actually quite a while to figure it out, but we experimentally we found out that apart from cosmic rays stabilizing small clusters, they are also accelerating the growth of these particles. And by having more cosmic rays, these particles are growing slightly faster. And when they grow slightly faster, it means that they have less time to get lost. So it sort of compensates for some of these effects. And this is exactly something that no model has included. At least nothing has been published up until this point. Now, I'm saying here that the cloud condensation nuclei has to be around 50 nanometer. We just published a paper where we use we just published a paper where we looked at the critical size of cloud condensation nuclei, and it was actually based on some airplane observations outside the coast of California, where it seems as if you had much higher supersaturation when you had very few cloud condensation nuclei or cloud droplets. And using satellite observations and trying to retrieve it, we can actually show that the critical size of cloud condensation nuclei over the oceans is actually somewhat smaller, and the supersaturation is actually much larger. I mean, typically, you talk about 0.2 to 0.3 in these clouds. These are low liquid clouds, but it's actually closer to 1. So the supersaturation is actually higher, and that means that the clouds are more sensitive to smaller aerosols, and it's also good for the mechanism that we are studying. Okay, so that was the presentation of some of the mechanism with the cosmic rays and clouds. Now I want to go to a completely different time scale, because cosmic rays have been entering into the atmosphere at all times. And I want to show you some correlations where you can actually see that even life in general has been affected by changes in cosmic rays. So remember that and this work is, of course, inspired by Near's work with the spiral arms, where he did that already in 2001. So what I want to do first, or what I did, was to try to reconstruct how many supernovas there are, because as we talked about in the beginning, it's the number of supernovas that determines the amount of cosmic rays that are hitting the Earth. That is the source of cosmic rays. And on long time scales, if you have a change in the star formation, you have a change in the number of supernovas, and therefore you also have a change in the number of cosmic rays entering into the Earth. So using open stellar clusters, there is around 1,000 of these open stellar clusters. If you have the age and the number of these, you can sort of estimate how much star formation that is happening around the solar system. This is the Pleiades that everybody knows. It's about 1,000 stars, and it's quite close to the solar system. So if I make this type of using the open stellar clusters, I get over the last 500 million years, you can see a change in the number of supernovas, or the supernova rate. And you see it's going up and down, and it looks very fluctuating as such. But the interesting thing is that if you look where you have glaciations, it looks that it fits very nicely where you have a high cosmic ray flux. So, but you can actually do it slightly better if you look at the last 200 million years. You can see here the change in the supernova rate, and then each of these points here are a reconstruction of the temperature of the ocean, where some shells lived. And you can see there is a nice correlation. I mean, you can even see here you have the glaciation of Antarctica. Then you have that it actually heated up, so the ice sheet became smaller, and then it reglaciated again. And it seems to be something that you can see in the data. So the important thing is that you have a very large temperature difference. It might be on the order of 10 degrees from here to here. So such large temperature changes will, of course, affect life on Earth. So if we now look at life, then the bioproduction that you have, there it is very important with the nutrients that goes into the ocean, phosphor, iron, nitrogen. And it is well known that life to all times had been limited by nutrients. So the change in nutrients, or the flux of nutrients into the system is extremely important. So if you have a large flux, you can have a large bioproduction. If you have a large bioproduction, you get more organic sediments, and you, of course, also have inorganic sediments. But you can then figure out what fraction of organic material there are in these sediments by looking at this isotope ratio. Here, this is carbon-13. It's a stable isotope. By about 1% of the carbon is in this form. So you can then, I mean, this is the Grand Canyon, and you can see you have all these layers from an old ocean bottom, and you can then measure this ratio, and from that you can estimate the fraction of organic material buried in sediments. And if I now try to compare this with the changes in cosmic rays or the number of supernovas, this is the change in supernovas from three different data sets. You see this correlation here, and you can see it's completely remarkable a correlation. So it means that the amount of organic material seems to be following the supernova rate. And the idea is that it probably has to do with the temperature difference between the equator and the polar regions. So when you have a large temperature difference, you have much more readily delivered nutrients to the biological system, and therefore you can have a higher biomass, and therefore you get a larger fraction of organic material buried in sediments. So it seems as if there is a remarkable correlation here, not just with climate, but also with things that are related to life. And we can even go further. Well, I mean, let me just say that the high cosmic flux, it seems to be a large bioproductivity and a large fraction of organic barrel, and then you have the vice versa here. So we have also, if we go out on 3.5 billion years, we can actually reconstruct also the star formation going back in time. So we have an interesting maximum here about 2 billion years ago, and then we have it was fairly quiet for 1 billion years. And here you see the last 500 million years, this was this change that we just looked at. But you also have the fraction of organic material because you have sediments that goes back that far. And here you see the changes in organic material, the fraction of organic material, and you can see there is a beautiful correlation between the two, which is remarkable. So it looks as if it's something that has affected the Earth at all times. There is an interesting connection that I should stress, and that is we have photosynthesis doing most of the time, I mean, for more than 3 billion years. So you have CO2 going together with water, and you get sugar and oxygen. But if you just leave the organic material on the surface, then bacteria or other things will just make the reaction go the other way, and you will not produce any oxygen. So in order to produce oxygen, you have to put it away. You have to take this part here away and put it into sediments. So that means that this curve here is actually the production of oxygen back in time. And we all know that oxygen is fundamental for having a complex life. So it's a really important connection. It doesn't mean that that 2 billion years ago you had very high oxygen in the atmosphere. It just means that you had a high production because a lot of it was lost as sediment at that time. So the question is, of course, why do we have these large peaks here? And they're probably nothing to do with the spiral arms. It's probably to do with the movement of small dwarf galaxies, and one of them that seems to be quite interesting is the Sagittarius dwarf galaxy. So if we look from our solar system and towards the galactic center, so just below, we can actually see this galaxy. And it has been going around the Milky Way, and you have tried to reconstruct it. And you can actually see for about 6 billion years ago, between 6 and 4 billion years ago, there was a large production of star formation. And that might actually be when the solar system was produced. But then around 2 billion years and 1 billion year, you actually see a large increase in star production, and therefore you also produce a lot of cosmic rays. And this is what we saw here and here. So these peaks might actually be because of interactions with, dwarf galaxies. So it means, if this is true, it means that the Earth is not very isolated. It's really part of a huge ecosystem as such. Okay. The last thing I want to show you is something I worked on for quite a while. And because if you have this effect on life, maybe it also is important for evolution. And if you go into the mountains, this is again Grand Canyon, you can go in and you can find various fossils, ammonites, you can have trilobites, and so on. And if you go into museums, they have collections of fossils from all kinds of periods. And all these fossils are then put into a large database. And if you look at this database, you can then reconstruct the diversity in the oceans, and it looks something like this. What I do here is I have 3 different ways of doing this, because the fossil, it's not everything that is fossilized, and this is the best we have. These are these fossils. So if I go into this database here, I have about 1 million species, and you can see I produce 3 different diversity curves. And they have some similarities, as you probably will agree to. So, where does life in the ocean flourish? And it is mainly along the shelves, along the continents. So these are these areas here where the depth of the ocean is less than about 200 meters. That is nearly where all the life is. As you go into the abyssal, the very deep ocean is like a desert. So you don't have much life in this part here. And it's an old thing that diversity is proportional to the area. It's something that has been known for quite a while. So if I now take these diversity curves and I look at how the area of these shelves, which can be reconstructed back about 400 to 500 million years, I can then normalize the diversity curves that we just saw, and I want to show you that the residual, what gets left, seems to be something related to the changes in supernova frequency. So this is the change in cosmic rays over this period, smoothed, and now I'll put the diversity curves after I have normalized with this area, and you see something like this. And it's a very nice correlation that you see. What I'm not showing you is that I can also take the northern hemisphere, and the area that you have to normalize with is very different from the southern hemisphere, so you get a very different normalization. And even when you do that and you make the normalization, you are left with something that looks like this: the change in cosmic rays. So it looks as if there's much more to this story than just global warming. And this is something that we have been working on for many years now. So let me just end by saying that it's not that, I mean, one necessarily should believe it, because if you look in the media, you will see that this work with, you know, it's not something that people in general like, or my colleagues. Cosmic rays not causing climate change. Cosmic rays add little to climate change. Cosmic radiation, but doesn't cause climate change, and so on. And we even have one here from CERN saying that it isn't really happening. And this is how it sort of ends. Thank you.